Story 1. The Shadow of Bell Creek. In the small, forgotten town of Bell Creek, the sun always seemed to set too early, casting long, unnerving shadows even in the middle of the day. The town had only one funeral home, and that was enough. Nathaniel Graves, the Undertaker, ran it alone, the sole occupant of a building that had once been a grand Victorian house. Over time, the town had come to associate him with death itself. Nathaniel was a quiet man, with thin, sharp features that seemed more skeletal than human. His pale eyes glimmered with a cold intelligence, but it was the way people spoke of him in whispers that piqued the curiosity of anyone who knew Bell Creek. They said he had a peculiar habit of arriving at the homes of the dying before their families even knew their time was near. And curiously, he always knew exactly how to prepare the body, as if he had done it 1,000 times. A young journalist named Emily, eager for a story to revive her failing career, visited Bell Creek on a slow, drizzly afternoon. She had heard the rumors, whispers of the strange deaths that occurred in the town and the even stranger Undertaker who never seemed to age. She rented a room in the local inn, a creaking building that smelled of mildew and dust, and decided to investigate. She started with Nathaniel's funeral home. The house, if you could call it that, was a strange mix of charm and foreboding. The wooden floors creaked as she entered, and the air smelled of incense, old books, and something more metallic, something older. Nathaniel greeted her with his customary politeness, his eyes studying her with a gaze that seemed to pierce her soul. As they talked, Emily noticed that there was something wrong about the place. The walls were lined with old photographs, portraits of the deceased. But unlike most funeral homes, the eyes of the dead in these photos were alive, too alive. They stared back at her with an intensity that was unsettling. "You must know, Miss Emily," Nathaniel said with a slight smile, "death is an art. And not just any art. The art of transformation." Emily tried to press him to get more out of him, but he would not be coaxed into revealing more than cryptic answers. That night, she returned to her room, troubled by the experience. The next day, Emily visited a local woman named Miriam, who had lived in Bell Creek all her life. Miriam had seen many things, she said, but what she told Emily next made her skin crawl. "You see, dear," Miriam began, her voice quivering, "Nathaniel, he doesn't just bury the dead. He collects them. He keeps them, in that old house of his. But not like you think. No, he keeps them to preserve them." Emily felt a shiver run through her, but Miriam wasn't done. "People around here say the dead never truly leave Bell Creek. That he's doing something, keeping them here, trapping their souls. They never rest. And every time someone dies, it's like he gets stronger." Determined to uncover the truth, Emily returned to the funeral home that evening. The door creaked open, but this time the air inside felt different. He was waiting for her. Nathaniel stood in the center of the room, a figure that seemed less human with every passing moment. "You've come to understand, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low and cold. Emily nodded, backing away slowly. "I keep them here," he continued, "not for myself but for the town. They protect this place. The dead are more powerful than you think. They guard what must remain hidden." In that moment, Emily realized the true horror of Bell Creek. The dead were never meant to leave. Nathaniel had been preserving them, not just as bodies, but as vessels, binding their souls to the land. And the town? The town was a prison, built on the backs of the dead, kept alive by Nathaniel's dark art. Emily tried to flee, but the door slammed shut behind her. The shadows that once only crept along the walls now seemed to move toward her, following her every step. Nathaniel was no longer just a man. He was the keeper of the town, a gatekeeper between life and death. And Bell Creek would never let her leave. Story 2. The Hollow of Blackthorn Ridge. Blackthorn Ridge was a town that seemed to exist outside the flow of time. The streets were narrow, winding through old buildings with sagging rooftops and faded paint. A heavy mist clung to the air, never quite dissipating, as if the town were shrouded in a perpetual veil of grief. The creek, which ran alongside the town, was dark and still, its waters moving at a lethargic pace, almost as though it too was waiting for something to stir. Samuel Turner had inherited the funeral home from his father, an enigmatic figure who had mysteriously vanished years ago. The house that housed the funeral home was as old as the town itself, its dark windows watching like cold, unblinking eyes. Samuel was a man of few words, keeping mostly to himself, and while his presence was unremarkable, there was always something unsettling about him. People said he had a look in his eyes, a kind of knowing, that made the air feel just a little bit colder whenever he entered a room. The locals in Blackthorn Ridge had grown used to Samuel's quiet, methodical ways. though many of them whispered behind his back, especially about the disappearance of his father. "There are those who say the creek is cursed," murmured old Mrs. Miller, the town's unofficial historian, as she leaned in close to Alice, a visitor who had recently moved to Blackthorn Ridge. "Strange things happen around here. I remember when Samuel's father vanished. It's as if he was taken by something." Alice, new to the town and eager to understand the secrets that seemed to cling to it, had asked about Samuel and his father. She knew that in a town as small as this, there had to be more to the story than the man behind the funeral home simply disappearing. "What do you mean, taken?" Alice had asked, her curiosity piqued. "Well, that's just it. No one saw him leave and no one saw him come back," Mrs. Miller continued, glancing around as though to make sure no one was listening. "There were rumors about Samuel's father being involved with, well, things that shouldn't be meddled with. There's a reason why the graveyard on the hill is so overgrown, you know. You should never go near it." The last part hung in the air, a warning unspoken. Alice, who was intrigued by the macabre, was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. She had arrived in Blackthorn Ridge to uncover the town's dark history, and she wouldn't let a vague warning stop her from learning more. The next day, Alice made her way to the funeral home. The heavy wooden door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing the dimly lit interior. The air was thick with the smell of formaldehyde and old wood. Behind the counter stood Samuel Turner, his thin, pale face as unreadable as always. He was preparing a coffin, methodically working with a calm precision that bordered on unsettling. "Can I help you, miss?" Samuel's voice was smooth yet distant, as though he were addressing her from some far-off place. I'm new in town," Alice began, hesitating for a moment. "I was hoping you could tell me more about your father. About how he disappeared." Samuel's face didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. There was a long pause, and then Samuel set down the tools in his hands. His eyes met hers, and Alice couldn't help but feel the weight of his gaze. It wasn't hostile, just incredibly focused, as though he could see through her. "My father," he said softly, "was the keeper of Blackthorn Ridge's secrets. He dealt with death and death dealt with him. But it was never supposed to happen like this." Alice, sensing she had struck a nerve, pushed further. "What do you mean?" Samuel's hand moved slowly to a small dusty box on the counter. He opened it, revealing an old yellow journal. His fingers trembled as he handed it to Alice. "Read this," he said. "It will explain everything." As Alice flipped through the pages of the journal, she uncovered a hidden history that was far darker than she could have imagined. The journal detailed rituals, cryptic symbols, and the strange powers Samuel's father had sought to harness. The man had made a pact with something, some force that lived within the waters of the creek, a presence that had haunted Blackthorn Ridge long before the town was built. "I thought I could undo it," Samuel continued, his voice a whisper now. "But every time I tried to stop the cycle, it only got worse. The town is bound to the creek. The dead never leave Blackthorn Ridge. And neither do the living once they're chosen." A chill ran down Alice's spine as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Samuel's father hadn't disappeared. He had become part of the land itself. His soul, along with others, had been absorbed into the cursed waters, bound to the town and its dark legacy. The creek, it seemed, was alive, more alive than anyone had ever realized. And it wanted something in return for the power it had given to Samuel's father. The pact that had been made was never meant to be broken. Samuel had tried, but now the price had to be paid. Suddenly, Alice understood. The spirits of the dead weren't just buried in the cemetery, they were trapped in the land itself, and the town had been built over their graves. No one ever truly left Blackthorn Ridge. Not if they didn't belong. Not if the creek had claimed them. As Alice stood, frozen, holding the journal, Samuel's voice broke the silence. "I need you to leave," he said quietly, though there was a hardness to his tone. "There's nothing you can do here. No one can escape the hollow." But it was too late. The air grew heavy, thick with a strange presence. Alice felt something moving around her, something cold and unseen. The shadows lengthened, and the walls of the funeral home seemed to pulse with an energy that wasn't entirely human. A scream echoed in the distance, a woman's scream, sharp and piercing. Alice turned to Samuel, but he wasn't looking at her anymore. His eyes were fixed on something beyond her, as though he could see something only he could understand. Then suddenly the lights flickered out, plunging them both into darkness. The temperature dropped even further, and the faintest whispers seemed to emanate from the very walls. "You've seen too much," Samuel said, his voice colder now, his tone detached. "You were never meant to know. The creek, it keeps what it claims. Before Alice could react, something cold and wet brushed her arm, like a shadow moving through the darkness. The last thing she heard before everything went black was the sound of rushing water, echoing from the creek, pulling her toward it. Story 3. The Morning of Ash Hollow. Ash Hollow was a town that felt as if it had been forgotten by time. The dense forest surrounding it blocked out much of the sunlight, leaving the town perpetually in the shadow of its ancient trees. The air was always thick, the weight of centuries of secrets pressing down on the people who lived there. It was a place where the past refused to stay buried. Elias Blackwood was the Undertaker in Ash Hollow, a man who had inherited his family's funeral business and a sinister reputation to go with it. He was a quiet man with deep-set eyes that always seemed to be watching, even when you weren't looking at him. His funeral home was the oldest building in the town, a decaying mansion with ivy creeping up its stone walls, its windows permanently shuttered as if to keep something inside. There were rumors about Elias, that he had been born under strange circumstances, that his family had a long history with the occult, and that Elias himself could do things that no ordinary man could. He had a way of making the dead seem alive again, but at a cost. The price of resurrection was steep, and no one ever spoke of what that price truly was. Tom had been living in Ash Hollow for a year when his wife, Caroline, died in a terrible accident. She had been found at the edge of the woods, her body lifeless as though the forest itself had claimed her. Grief-stricken and desperate, Tom sought out Elias Blackwood, hoping for a miracle. He had heard the whispers in the town, heard the stories of the Undertaker's dark abilities, and now he was willing to risk everything to bring his wife back. When Tom entered the funeral home, the air was thick with the smell of incense and something more ancient, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Elias stood in the dim light of the parlor, his figure looming over a wooden coffin, his pale face illuminated only by the flickering candlelight. "Mr. Blackwood," Tom began, his voice trembling. "I need your help. I want to bring Caroline back." Elias looked up slowly, his cold, unreadable eyes meeting Tom's. "You want her back," Elias repeated as though tasting the words. "You want to undo death. But be warned, death does not forget." "I'll pay whatever it costs," Tom said, desperate. Elias's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smile. "The cost, Mr. Grant, is always higher than you think. It is not money that death demands. It is your soul." Tom, in his grief, didn't understand the weight of Elias's words. He agreed without hesitation, eager to see Caroline again. That night, they performed the ritual in the back of the funeral home, an ancient incantation that had been passed down through the Blackwood family for generations. As the candles burned low and the chant echoed in the silence, Tom felt a strange pull at his heart, a tug that seemed to come from the very earth beneath him. And then there she was, Caroline, standing before him, pale but alive. Her eyes were dull as if she were sleepwalking, but it was her. He could feel her warmth, her breath. But something was wrong. Caroline's smile was forced, her movements stiff. She didn't speak. And the longer Tom looked at her, the more he felt the absence in her eyes, the absence of the soul that had once been hers. Elias's voice broke the silence. "You see, Mr. Grant, the price has been paid. She's yours once more. But remember, what you take from death must be returned. And I have only so many souls to give." As Tom reached for Caroline, he felt the room shift. The walls seemed to close in, and the shadows grew long and threatening. The ground beneath him trembled, as if the earth itself was protesting what had been done. "You can't undo what's been done," Elias said, his tone no longer calm but cold and detached. "The dead cannot be returned without taking something in exchange." Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the room was filled with a cacophony of whispers, hundreds of voices all crying out. The shadows that had once seemed still now writhed around them. Tom turned to Elias, his heart sinking. "What's happening?" he whispered. Elias stepped back, his expression distant. "You've brought her back, but in doing so, you've awakened something older, something hungrier. The forest, the land, the town, they all feed on the living as much as the dead. And now it wants you." Tom turned to Caroline, but her face had shifted. Her eyes were hollow, empty, a mirror of the darkness surrounding them. The door behind them opened, and the whispers grew louder, pulling Tom toward the edge of the room, toward the abyss. The price of resurrection was steep. Too steep.